sitasimama maovu yakitawala. Ufisadi, ubinafsi, ukabila, kuuza sura, wataki kuuza sera. Undugu ni kufaana, sitasimama maovu yakitawala. Sitasimama maovu yakitawala. Hatujakwalifa, una deserve bila kasha makashfa. Hii society Kenya wanaeza share ni nyungu ya busa ama kecho ya shisha. Mfuko zinasikia eko, unajua thamani ya mali na size ya kifuli. Eyo, ujaibiwa jua unakaa kitu wo. Risking jail time, police kule flow. Unaweza argue, crime doesn't pay, lakini huwezi dismiss justice in a pay. Mwizi ana 40 days, 365 days later, anaendelea kuprofata. Do anything for power, ready to lose their head for presidency. Bora waione kwa currency. Sababu gani si perfect days at ambulance? Nikifly angani, ninazoa the same feeling. Matatu zikipitia pot mtaani. Juliane, yeah. Kontaka siwezi karanga. Shagala bagala, niko tayari nilipa gharama. Sitasimama maovu yakitawala. Sitasimama maovu yakitawala. Ufisadi, ubinafsi, ukabila, kuuza sura, wataki kuuza sera. Undugu nikufana, sitasimama maovu yakitawala. Sitasimama maovu yakitawala. Joe lays funds, itabidi raise hands. Glory kwa sun, breakfast at croissant. Hataki punguze bei ya bidhaa, tunataka opportunities ndio tu afford hizo bidhaa. Walisema kutembea kwingi ndio kuona mengi, nimeshinda nikitembea maofisi na sijaiona kazi. Sasa cheza golf kwenye Tiger Woods, mambo si barabara chingu. Naomba jani masi, chakule fike tumboni ikitoka kwa sahani. Policeman anapiga rungu, mwalimu daktari anamurushia tear gas, na mtoto wake anarudishwa nyumbani, hana school fees analipopina. Siwezi karanga, uwe hai, shagala bagala, niko tayari nilipa gharama. Sitasimama maovu yakitawala. Sitasimama maovu yakitawala.
Welcome to session 10 of the Pan-African Activist Sunday School. My name is Bwesije Boamwesijire, and I am joining in from Los Angeles. And Pan-African Activist Sunday School is an initiative of the Pan-African Activist Solidarity Collective that was started by two of hosts, Dr. Nanri Nafsaiga and Dr. Christo Strong. The collective organizes campaigns for solidarity in various places where people of African descent live. And we've, as I've already said, this is our 10th session of the Pan-African Sunday School, which is one of the many initiatives of the Pan-African Activist Solidarity Collective. Today's session builds on previous sessions that we have held this summer, this June and July, which have been on Kenya and its deployment of troops in Haiti and African state solidarity with Palestine. These two sessions are in conversation with the current session because we talked about Kenya a lot in the previous session. And as if something else was happening at the time, Kenya has an uprising happening right now. Kenyan people are upset about very many things that their government has been doing, including one of the things that we talked about in the previous sessions. And they went on the streets to protest against the finance bill for this year. But as the speakers today will tell us, this goes beyond just the finance bill. And today's session is going to be co-hosted by myself with Nanri and Crystal. And as the audience, we want you to contribute to the conversation. So please send us your comments, send us your questions at all times during the programming. And the session is going to have 4 main parts. We're going to start by laying out the context of the current crisis. And then we will move to other African experiences of IMF-led neoliberalism. And then we will come back to Kenya and look at popular resistance against austerity. And then the second last part will be on the international dimensions of this uprising. And then we will close out with interaction with the speakers. My colleague Nanri is going to lead us through the first part. And we'll start with introducing the speakers for the first part. Nanri, are you ready?
Yes, thanks, Bill. Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon, good evening, good night, wherever you are. Thank you so much for attending our 10th Pan-African Activist Sunday School. So just to get right into things, the first part of the discussion is actually going to be setting the context for the discussion. And we are going to begin with discussing the long history of Kenyan people's resistance and the place of July 7th in understanding the Reject Finance Bill of 2024. So welcoming our first speaker, Caroline Mose. Caroline Mose is a commentator on politics and culture, and she will be discussing the long history of Kenyan people's resistance. Thank you so much, Caroline. You're welcome.
Thank you very much, everyone, and I hope you can hear me. I come to you from this evening in Nairobi. Before I even start speaking, I also want to add that apart from being a political commentator, I'm also a scholar of popular movements and popular cultures and popular protests with a long academic history behind that. So I'm coming to you sort of as a scholar of what is happening in the moment and what has been happening coming to these moments. But I'm also coming to you as a Kenyan who is currently in Nairobi, in the heart of what is happening here. And before I even say anything, I know other Kenyans who are on the panel with me and Kenyans who are listening to us will agree with me that these have become very personal and very emotional moments for us, because we are talking about this, we are analyzing this, we are theorizing this as we go, as we live it, as we exist within these spaces in this moment. And today is the 7th of July, 2024. And I want to start my talk by, because today is a day we mark in Kenya, we call it the Sabasaba Day. The first, that name of Sabasaba comes from July 7th of 1990, which was the first Sabasaba rally. In Kiswahili, Sabasaba is 7/7, so the 7th of the 7th month, which is July, which is today. On Sabasaba in 1990, there was, it was the day in which protests against the autocratic government of former President Moi, who is now late, actually happened at Nairobi at the Kamukunji grounds, which are grounds which have been used for political meetings and gatherings by the public. And in that, we had some key figures, including Stanley Matiba, Charles Rubia, James Orengo, Njeru Kathangu, George Anyona, and Martin Shikuku, who all at that time had been called the Young Turks prior to that day, and also included Raila Odinga, amongst others. And on that day, they gathered at Kamukunji grounds for a political rally in which they were actually trying to push for the end of the autocratic rule there was a one-party state, a de facto one. It was actually a one-party state, and that had happened earlier. So on that day, there was a meeting at Kamukunji. Obviously, the state was not going to support that, and police were unleashed, and there were running battles and violence unleashed upon the people by the Kenyan police on that day, and 39 people lay dead at the end of that day. And this just didn't happen in Kamukunji. This also happened in different other spaces across Kenya on that day, July 7th of 1990, which sparked what were called the Sabasaba protests. And what happened that day was to expose the political underbelly of the reign of President Moi at that time, to the point where he banned the use of the term Sabasaba and made it illegal to use that term. And so from that year onwards, every year we commemorate Sabasaba Day through different things. You find that there are different meetings across the country talking about different things. And I will come as I end my talk to discuss about what Sabasaba for 2024 has meant for us here in Kenya. And so from before even the Young Turks were formed, there has been a bit of a disturbing way in which history is not really taken. It's being dismissed. And what is happening in Kenya today is not happening in a social or political vacuum. Rather, there has been a long history. And my job today is to open this by highlighting what this long history of protest has been. And if we start even before independence, we see the Mau Mau Uprising, which was a popular uprising and which followed the same pattern we see today, where there was state crackdowns, there were kidnappings, there were detentions, there were murders, extrajudicial killings by the state at that time, which was the colonial state, which obviously we now know and we term as a settler colony, where these people come in to occupy a space that is already occupied by native people. And so we saw the Mau Mau Uprising, and Mau Mau Uprising was an uprising that was multi-pronged. There was, it was an uprising about reclaiming the land, reclaiming leadership, reclaiming culture, and reclaiming different things that had been plundered and had been taken away by the colonialists. And I always say this, that for many countries on the continent, colonialism was not a 2-week affair. It was not, that the colonialists landed and then after 2-3 months, there was an uprising and then they left. Colonialism was an enterprise that took decades and decades. So by the time of this uprising, which was not the only uprising on the continent, there were many other uprisings in different parts of the continent. So this uprising was multi-pronged. It wanted different things, which all went towards the same thing of the colonial state must cease. And after independence, of course, we saw for us in Kenya, the first president, who was Jomo Kenyatta, did set in place some customs, some political customs that became very problematic. And we saw a lot of political unrest as he started to rule. We saw a lot of political assassinations. And in the first years, he leaned, clearly into autocracy. And in 1982, there was a constitutional amendment. This was now after he had passed on and Moi had taken taken power. We speak about the attempted coup in Kenya in 1982 without talking about what happened to trigger the coup. And what actually triggered the coup was that earlier in 1982, there was a constitutional amendment, which was called the Act of 1980, which declared that the only political party allowed to operate in Kenya was going to be the Kenya African National Union, which is KANU. And Section 40 of the then constitution was repealed, and Kenya reverted to become a one-party state. And why was that a problem? It's because that was a way in which dissenting voices became excluded. If you are a member of the party, you had to have a sworn card to say that you are a sworn member of the party. And that card is what you would use to access jobs. You'd use to be able to buy land, to be able to get your children into schools and to get jobs, to get scholarships, etc. So in essence, dissenting voices, people who refused to join the ruling party and get that card that you're a sworn member of the ruling party, became excluded. They became excluded politically, they became excluded socially, they became excluded economically as well, and became very disenfranchised. And so the attempted coup in August of 1982 was one of the ways that the people who've been excluded from the conversation were attempting to gain back and to remove those exclusions and to have a fair chance of participating as Kenyans. And obviously we saw what happened there, with 1982, and that went on into 1990. Between those years, we saw a lot of political detentions where people who were seen to be dissenters, including Raila Odinga, were taken into detention and were jailed without trial and for years and years. And we had a high number of people who were detained in different jails, some at, and of course they had to pass through the infamous Nyati House and Nyayo House torture chambers in the heart of the capital, Nairobi, where they were tortured, where they all manner of things were done to them. At different, we've had many writings about that, including late Wahome Mutahi's 3 Days on the Cross, which highlights in fiction, but of course in reality, what was going on at the time. And so we come now down to Sabasaba, and these protests arise, and of course now the clamor for multi-party, for political freedom started there. And it was not just about, and of course this has been distilled and reduced to let's just have more than one political party, but it was about busting the chains of being a member of a ruling party and only gaining access to things that were the right of people to access only by being a sworn card-carrying member of the ruling party. And then, of course, there was Sabasaba, and there were riots all over the place. And then in 1992, the mothers of political prisoners led an 11-month hunger strike that culminated at Uhuru, in Uhuru Park's Freedom Corner. From 28th of was it February 1992, the mothers camped there with the late Professor Wangari Maathai, and they stayed there until March 3rd. And on March 3rd, then President Moi again sent his policemen to come in and remove these women because they were causing, an embarrassment, not just nationally, but also internationally. And obviously on March 3rd, there were these riots again at Uhuru Park, where policemen actually went in and began to beat very, very violently these mothers of political prisoners. And what they did at that point is that they actually, these were elderly women, they stripped naked and they shook their breasts at the police. And for those who understand African culture, when it is a taboo to see, or for your eyes to fall upon the nude body of a woman who is at the age of either your mother, your grandmother. And so when they did that, and the policemen, there are these iconic photos online of policemen trying to beat these women while covering their eyes because they knew that they were being cast in that moment. And that can actually be taken back to 70 years earlier in 1922, on March 16th, actually, when Modhoni Nyanjiro had stripped naked in a political protest when she was demanding the release of Harry Thuku, who was actually known as the Chief of Women because he was known to really agitate for women's rights. And so when she stripped naked, the act of removing her clothes was to tell the men who were there with her and to ask them, why are you being cowed? Are you, you should give me your gonads and your pants because I have more courage than you. And so in that moment, when you come back to 1992, these women were actually asking these policemen, how are you conducting these illegal beatings? Why are you only listening to one? Are you not men that you can also make your own judgments instead of blindly following a regime that is corrupt and a regime that is violent? And in that sense, we can see the connection. And I bring us back even to earlier this year in 2024 with the femicide protests in Kenya, which was basically leaderless and was a grassroots movement that protested the killings of women that had become rampant in the city, in the country, where women were being brutally murdered and nothing was being done. And so you can see the linkages, these linkages coming in, where grassroots protests and political movements actually rise up and speak back to power. And of course, we are all aware of what happened in 2007, post-election violence, where more than 1,000 people were actually murdered by the police in extrajudicial killings. When the violence broke out, and of course had been obviously sponsored and planned by different political players within Kenya, as the elections were being contested. And these were the elections of Mwai Kibaki when he was coming into his second reign, into his second term. And so when you see all these kinds of different movements, and there are many other movements that I'm not able to speak about in the short time I have left, but there have been various people-led grassroots movements that speak back to power. And when you bring all these things together, and then we come to the Reject Finance Bill 2024 protests, that started basically in rejecting the finance bill, which I discussed last time and said that the highlights is that this finance bill was one seen to be actually pushed by imperial powers, by the Americans and by International Monetary Fund. That's the IMF. And I remember saying that Congress members from the United States were actually spotted in the Kenyan parliament, sitting in sessions where the finance bill was being debated by Kenyan MPs. And so these concerns actually, you know, they then ended up into what we have now and what we are seeing now. Between the time I last spoke and now, we've seen a lot of violence in the Reject Finance Bill 2024 movement. We've had 43 people now murdered, and a high number of those had been kidnapped and abducted by police or police agents, and then disappeared and then later found dead. A number of those were killed live on camera as they participated in peaceful protests, specifically on June 25th. And so between now and then, there has been an outrage, not just online or in the streets, but also online in different spaces. And I know there's another speaker who will come in and speak about that. But what we're now seeing is that this movement is slowly morphing into anti-corruption movement, into an anti-regime movement, because the regime continues to be tone deaf, continues to refuse to read the room, continues to have hard stances on not getting rid of incompetent CSs, incompetent advisors, etc. And so that hard stance, and I know that there was, there have been different Twitter spaces where even the president himself attended one, hosted one, and there were all these questions that were being fielded. But the general feeling was that the president is not listening, is only playing defense, and is intent on continuing with this. And so as I wind up, the question then becomes, where are we going from here? Which would be the question. And of course, as this movement continues to be leaderless and continues to be grassroots-led, my point that I really wanted to make is that there's been a long history of this, and we are very excited. As I said, we are living through this. We are very excited to see where this goes going on from here, including the resolve to make the lives of corrupt leaders, corrupt members of parliament, very difficult. Deplatforming them and refusing them a platform has been one of the ways I have seen this happening across the country. And I end there, and I give the space to the next person to take us to the next the next portion of this discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Caroline. Always a pleasure to hear you, and I hope you also drop your handles in the chat as well. The very rich history, and I'm learning so much. I didn't even know that today was the anniversary of the Saba Saba rally, taking us back to the history of the Mau Mau, and especially highlighting the roles of women in protest. And it's just so remarkable to hear this history and to really sit in the knowledge that this is the foundation, because oftentimes I think people feel like, oh, this is just happening, but of course your scholarship and your journalism has demonstrated and shows the very rich history of activism. So thank you so much again. So we're going to bring up the next speaker. The next speaker is going to talk about 80 years of IMF-led exploitation and Kenya's path to the current moment. Catherine Amai. Catherine is a writer and a researcher, and she's going to also tell us a little bit more about her background as we bring her on. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Nari and Dr. Caroline. My name is Catherine Amai. I'm a researcher, a writer, and a commentator of social issues. So I'm going to take us through the next session of this discussion. I want to take us through the 80 years of IMF-led exploitation and what has led us to this moment. So I'll give us a brief background of the IMF, how it was established, as well as the journey that it has taken, particularly in the global south, but I'll still narrow it down to Kenya and this particular moment. So the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund were established post-World War II. That is the year 1944, which is exactly 80 years ago today in 2024. According to them and their charter, they were established to help restore and sustain the benefits of global integration by promoting international economic cooperation. So the two institutions have two separate mandates, so to say. So the World Bank funds long-term infrastructural projects, while the IMF funds short-term projects under strict conditionalities. So for the IMF, for example, it comes to you as a state, for example, and it issues you with a loan. And with this loan, there comes certain conditionalities where the loanee is expected to increase taxes to be able to pay back that loan. And often these taxes target the poorest people. And alongside some of the things that you're required to do is to cut public spending. And what do we mean by public spending? We're talking about spending on education, on healthcare, on job creation, on manufacturing, food, water, and other essential needs. So they tell you that once you do this, you'll be able to grow your GDP, that is the gross domestic product, and as well as other fancy economic terminologies. And for full disclosure, I want economics as a discipline to be abolished because it's just ridiculous, really. So anyway, that aside, so when the IMF comes to you, it will tell you, you need to cut all this public spending for you to gain this loan from us. Or if you owe other people as well, other multinational funders, they will come to you to rescue you from those kinds of loans. But then the interesting thing is that the IMF is largely located in the global south in terms of their operational mandate. But we know that the IMF is headquartered in Washington, D.C., as well as the World Bank. In fact, the two institutions are situated right across each other on the same street. But one thing we know for sure is that since its inception, the IMF has existed, as well as the World Bank, to advance the geopolitical ends of Americans and Western Europe. So one thing that comes out of this is that we see the US president having a lot of power in how the World Bank operates. For example, the president of the US is the one who selects the president of the World Bank. Number two, we also see the IMF having a lot of control by the EU member states, who also select the executive director. An American professor, Michael Hudson, has described the IMF and the World Bank as tools of American imperialism. In his 1972 groundbreaking book, Super Imperialism, The Economic Strategy of American Empire, Hudson outlines how America has always used debt as a leverage for its imperial expansionism, and that the establishment of the World Bank and the IMF was conceived from this. One can therefore look at the IMF and the World Bank debt infrastructure through several lenses, but two stick out for me. They are specifically designed to help the colonial enterprise. They were specifically designed to help the colonial enterprise transition seamlessly into a post-colonial era, because we see the creation of the World Bank around the time when so many African states were, gaining independence, or at least they gained independence some 10 years later. So the mood was already set that there's going to be a transition. And these countries, the colonial masters, were preparing for that post-colonial era, and therefore they had to establish that kind of global order to ensure that the plunder and the extraction continued. And then there's also the fact that the IMF is very heavily controlled, and the World Bank as well, by America in particular. And this just means that America knew that by establishing this sort of financial institution, they would grow their wealth beyond their wildest imagination. So these two reasons for me are why the IMF and the World Bank exists. Outside whatever is published in those fancy reports. And this is why countries like Kenya, and I suspect every other African country, have consistently had ex-IMF and ex-World Bank executives in key economic and physical roles, such as the central bank governor, the minister of finance. Here in Kenya, we term it as the cabinet secretary. We see them being in leading positions still within those institutions of finance by being directors, senior economic advisors, and even in the current, the recently constituted the constituted task force that was supposed to audit the debts that Kenya owes. The one that was created on Friday by President William Ruto has an IMF official inside it. So you can see the sort of reach that the IMF has, as well as the World Bank, in our politics, in our economic policies, in terms of just having a lot of reach in terms of the infrastructure and how they control it. So I'd argue that the debt in the neocolonial context has been bureaucratized so badly that it's almost invisible and even acceptable. So how does IMF and World Bank, what are some of the key moments that we've seen them, having that kind of, control within Kenya? So the US economy significantly collapsed during the Cold War era, and it needed money from somewhere. And this is when we see the IMF coming in so strongly into the global south, having a lot of, reach and having the power to really dictate fiscal policy. So in the 1980s and in the 1990s, these were some of the most brutal years for Kenyans with regard to the IMF and the World Bank presence. The Moi regime took loans that were tied to brutal conditionalities. The IMF mandated public infrastructure restructuring known as structural adjustment programs. And these, here the government arbitrarily rolled out massive retrenchment of public civil servants. So while high-ranking officials were paid off, most of the lower-ranking workers waited for their pensions for years. And this is something that was called the golden handshake, where people were retrenched from public service. And this was, it had a wide reach. And so many of these people went out. Some of them had not, quite reached the retirement age. And this pension was not enough because they had been retired before their time to retire. And some of the other areas that were affected in the economy included areas like agriculture. In Kenya, for example, agriculture employs about 40% of Kenyans, and 70% of rural Kenyans also work within the agricultural sector. And agriculture as a sector contributes to about 33% of the gross domestic product. So we see this kind of the structural adjustment programs coming in and saying that we need these subsidies removed from fertilizer, from insecticide, from seeds. And so many farmers suffered a lot during this era because they were unable to now buy these farm inputs at reasonable prices. And as much as farming is, it is structured in a way that farmers are doing the work locally, we also need farm implements. So like things like tractors for those that required them, and so many other implements that farmers use were, the subsidies were removed, and therefore they became very, very expensive. And so most farmers, had to either sell their land or lease this land or find alternative forms of just gaining the socioeconomic sustenance. And we're talking about most farmers, like maybe abandoning farming, going into cities to work, to supply their labor cheaply. And these were some of the consequences of these kinds of subsidy removal and just price hikes across the board. And for people who depend on food from farmers, this is of course a majority of the population. Now issues around importation of food became very pertinent because now there was no ready foodstuffs from farmers who had abandoned all these. We're also talking about alternative occupations such as mining. Many people who were previously farmers had to go into these alternative means of just gaining a livelihood, and this came at a great ecological, economic, and social cost. But then the one thing that stands out in all IMF and World Bank programs are the bad economic conditions for the masses. For example, the World Bank creates this situation where it will build this major infrastructure like dams, but then most of them will just end up being wild elephants. So in the Kenyan case, we see a lot of projects by the World Bank, but then they are abandoned because they were not intended to, in fact, function in the first place. So I want to give a context of these, the IMF as an institution with some of the global geopolitical sort of underpinnings that we have seen around. So what does the war in Ukraine, the genocide in Palestine, as well as the genocide in Haiti have to do with these new taxes, with these finance bill that Kenyans are in fact protesting? So the World Bank and the IMF have continued to give Kenya loans throughout the last 40 years. And of course, most recently, over the last 10 years, that has escalated. During the COVID pandemic, they gave so many loans. And so these loans, so Kenya has been a recipient of these loans. And they're not just World Bank and IMF loans. There are also some from private hedge funds. And some of these hedge funds invest their money in things like war, So we have these people coming into this kind of ecosystem, and once the government borrows this money, then the IMF will come in and say that we want to help you to offset that debt. And so Kenya has been on the receiving end of this. The cost of fuel doubled within Ruto's first 3 months in office. That was between the month of August 2022 and January 2023, and so did the price of everything else. He was unapologetic about removing subsidies right in the heels of the pandemic, terming the subsidy as unsustainable. Curiously and unsurprisingly, despite this being a very extremely unpopular move among the masses, there was a lot of propaganda around it, and people, including so many prominent economists, some of who did not even support Mr. Ruto directly, were in the media, trying to endorse this subsidy removal and terming it as a consumption cost that should not, in fact, exist. So eventually, we're talking about fuel that doubled to 200 Kenya shillings. That is something it was, just 3 months earlier, it was at 110 shillings. Around 3 months later, it had already jumped to 200 Kenya shillings because of the removal of subsidies. And this is something that has been analyzed, including by economists outside Kenya. For example, I'll quote the Zambian economist, Dr. Grieve Chelwa, who says that the IMF's directive on removal of subsidies on essential commodities like fuel often unleashes a brutal cost of living crisis on the ordinary masses, and it cripples the economy in a way that will take ages to rectify. Because these are things that have happened in Zambia, in Ghana, in Nigeria, in so many other African countries. And so we're looking at a pattern of exploitation and plunder and really disregarding people's labor and people's resources. So his words echo those of the radical Pan-African leader of Burkina Faso, Thomas Sankara, who told us decades ago about debt. And he said this, and I just want to quote him: "Debt cannot be paid." So that was Thomas Sankara's position. But I want to also add it further, that this debt is given precisely because the giver, and that is the empire, expects you not to pay, and for which you'll pay an even bigger price, including death. And this is, of course, colonialism really in its most distilled form. So the current finance bill in Kenya is one such document loaded with so much debt. Mr. Ruto was part of the previous regime, and he was part of this debt acquisition. So the idea that he's inheriting a debt is again misleading, because he was part of this borrowing. And you look at this particular finance bill taking away some of the most mundane things from people, putting tax on bread, putting tax on sanitary towels, putting tax on diapers, tax on land, tax on motor vehicle, everything is like taxed to the last detail, and there's a lot of surveillance around it. And so we see even that kind of arrogance across the people who are in the limelight regarding these politicians who are trying to front this bill and disregarding people's people's protest long before it was a physical protest in the streets, because there's a slot in our constitution which in fact allows for public participation. And so the chair of the finance committee would come on TV and tell people that we will pass it no matter what you say. So we see the same, hubristic statements emanating from the IMF as well. Just during this protest, during this uprising, they released a statement saying that the president and the political class should hold their ground. So we see that as well. And of course, what ground is that? Dismissing the will of the people, murdering people in cold blood, enslaving people with oppressive taxes, and squashing any hope for socioeconomic mobility, as well as just entrenching a police state, like the military, having the military with so much power within our territory. So the IMF is a tool for the US empire, and this is not a metaphor that we just use. This is, in fact, in its, they do this because that is exactly why the IMF exists. It has constantly given unconditional grants, for example, to Ukraine. The IMF has given money to Egypt since Israel started its assault in Gaza too. And this money is largely pumped into Egypt's surveillance and defense industry. And this is essentially to fortify the border with Gaza to ensure that Palestinians will not flee violence. So another way in which we see IMF's hand in destabilizing societies is in Haiti. I'll give to just wrap it up, and I'll give a quick brief of what has been happening in Haiti. For example, in 2021, during the COVID pandemic, the IMF sanctioned the government of Haiti to remove fuel subsidies, exactly like it did here in Kenya. But then there was a massive uprising. And that is, what then those sustained protests and what has now come to be known as, Haiti gangs. So some of these taxes are being squeezed from the poor and consequently defunding key infrastructure like education, food, healthcare, things that people need to live. And this is why the IMF needs this money, because it's funding wars in other places. So we are just part of that kind of conduit in terms of facilitating US imperialism by having our labor, our resources go towards this. So I'll just conclude this with words from Thomas Sankara. Debt cannot be repaid. First, because if we don't repay, lenders will not die. That is for sure. But if we repay, we are going to die. That is also for sure. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Catherine. And that's also a very, very, very powerful point to end. Because what we're going to move to now is a section that is going to explore other African countries' experiences with the IMF and IMF policies. So we're staying in East Africa a little bit. We're going west to Uganda, and we're going to learn a little bit about how Ugandans responded to these structure adjustment policies that were introduced before Museveni took power, but then Museveni, in the spirit of excelling in only the bad things, took it as a notch higher, to the point that Uganda is regarded as, Africa's version of Chile. If Chile is the country where structure adjustment policies were first introduced under the dictator Pinochet, Museveni became Africa's Pinochet in that sense. This is in the late 1980s, early 1990s. So in a way, we're moving to Uganda to pick some lessons or to compare experiences from a people's perspective. So it's my pleasure to introduce Mary Serumaga. Mary Serumaga is an independent researcher. Remedies. Currently, she's completing a history of colonialism. She's a widely published essayist, with her work appearing on the Committee for the Cancellation of the Third World Debt website, cadtm.org, The Elephant, which is a Kenyan-based publication, African Arguments, Transition Magazine, and Uganda's Monitor and Observer newspapers, among other outlets. Mary led the National Unity Platform NUP's policy team, which developed the NUP Manifesto for 2021 to 2026. You're welcome, Mary, and take it away.
Thank you very much, Wesije. Good evening, everybody. Thank you for having me. I really always wanted to speak to your audience in particular about these matters. So thank you. And I'll just get straight into it. So I'm calling this paper The Structural Adjustment from Below. We've heard how it's imposed from above, and recently Kenyans have tried to adjust what's happening in their economy from below, and Ugandan youth are talking about doing the same. So it's called structural adjustment from below. In looking for solutions to the cost of living crisis in Kenya and Uganda, it may be helpful to look for patterns in governance that give rise to these crises. So there are patterns that you can discern that show you why you're in that situation or we are in that situation. The major similarity between the two countries is that both are undergoing another cycle of structural adjustment. It may be that Kenya and Uganda differ in their capacities to implement reforms. Uganda's attempts at structural adjustments in the 1990s produced a litany of failed targets. That's not a personal opinion, it is based on the official reviews of the World Bank at the close of its SAP projects. The trend continued into the new millennium. Having missed reform targets in the areas of economic and financial management reform, Uganda then attempted to redo the reforms. I argue that one, redoing failed loan financed projects using further loans contributes to Uganda's low standard of human development because essentially you're paying twice for the same thing. And secondly, public finance management and governance generally are such that the country, Uganda, is just no longer capable of implementing complex programs. Unlimited and perennial austerity, insufficiency, inequality, and social unrest are merely symptoms of that fact. Any plans to break out of the cycle need to address this question. When a project fails because of lender incompetence or even corruption, are the citizens of the borrower country liable for the debt? Because if you have paid or you're paying for structural adjustment for which you borrowed money 20 years ago and the adjustment hasn't taken place, something went wrong. So if it's found that the lender was not duly diligent in lending or in designing the project, are you still liable for the debt? So that's just something to bear in mind. And in the second half of this presentation, I shall discuss the contribution of the IMF and World Bank to the cost of living crises experienced in East Africa and elsewhere. So on to the Kenyan uprising. Kenya's recent uprising against an insupportable cost of living follows in the tradition of anti-austerity protests. The austerity is a result of IMF and World Bank economic policies adopted by indebted governments of developing countries. A similar wave swept through Latin America, North Africa, and the Middle East in 2019. You may remember those. More recently, 12,500 cost of living protests circled the globe between November 2021 and October 2022, protesting shrinking access to essentials such as fuel, gas, and electricity, which is what our colleague from Kenya has just been talking about. In Kenya 2024, the protests were triggered by proposed cuts in fuel subsidies and by income tax increases and a housing levy on both employees and employers. A tax on bread and on an eco tax went a step too far, and in fact these were the first to be dropped by the government in its gradual climb down from the Finance Act of 2024. President Ruto's government is now considering funding the budget through cost-saving measures rather than maintaining the current extravagant level of expenditure and demanding ever more frugality from the public. Uganda, too, has hunger issues. Undernourishment rose by 1% a year between 2006 and 2011. It accelerated by 2 percentage points every year from 2011 onwards. It rose from 39% in 2015 to 41% in 2016. And then that particular indicator was dropped by the World Bank, the online data bank, although it's since been reinstated. But there was about 3-year gap when they just stopped quoting undernourishment statistics. We had the first 1,000 days nutrition program meant to alleviate malnutrition. And during its 5-year run, undernourishment increased. The program failed by the World Bank's assessment, by the government's assessment, because, like many others, Uganda did not meet its co-financing obligations. It didn't have the money. Uganda still faces structural issues that were meant to have been adjusted in the 90s. Take high administrative overheads. They were supposed to have been fixed by the $90 million Economic and Financial Management Project of 1991 to 95. Cash for investment in better quality and more far-reaching service delivery was meant to be freed up by reducing the size of the administration from 39 to 22 ministries, reducing the number of public servants by about half, eliminating allowances paid to staff, and stopping extravagant expenditure such as departmental vehicles and fuel. Remaining staff were meant to receive enhanced salaries with the savings in order to maintain lifestyles comparable to the private sector, so that you could attract and retain the best, you could compete with the private sector in attracting and retaining the best people for the job. However, within 20 years, the number of ministries has crept back up and it's exceeded the baseline number that we started with. The size of parliament has doubled or more, and status-related allowances have been reinstated. So salaries, public sector salaries, were enhanced and allowances reduced or eliminated. And then the allowances have been reinstated on top of the enhanced salaries. Yes. So one of those allowances is a new one. It's called a service award, and it's payable on leaving office. And that's on top of the statutory retirement benefits. Commissioners for Parliament receive the equivalent. They voted themselves the equivalent of $135,000. That 500 million shillings is enough to furnish rural schools with 5,000 desks. Many children currently sit on rocks or bricks. So what were the reforms under the Ugandan Structural Adjustment Program, which for short we'll call the SAP? They were to reduce electricity subsidies paid to the Electricity Board by privatizing power production, transmission, and distribution, and making them more efficient. Increasing food yields by privatizing agricultural extension. Increasing access to primary education through a universal primary education program. And broadening access to health care through a national health insurance plan and a minimum national health care package. So every Ugandan was meant to have access to a minimum national health care package. And those programs closed in the 1990s, and what remains to be done has been mainstreamed. So a roundup of the results of Uganda's SAP of the 90s. Electricity generation, transmission, and distribution were privatized and dams were built. But subsidies to the private electricity distribution company, UMEME, have outstripped the level paid to the old electricity board. In 2022, industrial parks, two private industrial parks, were given subsidies, making their tariffs some of the lowest in the country, lower even than domestic consumers. The private distributor, UMEME, was also guaranteed compensation for any losses owing to low uptake of electricity. Essentially, if they can't sell the power they have, then government compensates them for a certain amount of unsold power. Then there's the Rural Electrification Program, which is meant to connect more of the rural population to the grid. In 2020, it met only 7% of target connections. In 2018, it met 51%, and in 2006, it met 30%. So it can hardly be called a success. After retrenchment of public agricultural extension workers, the 162 million National Agricultural Advisory Service, NADS, did not increase food yields as expected. The official review says that food yields did not change, and in fact, the agricultural machinery that was distributed by NADS was captured by the elite. Then there was the $65 million District Health Services Pilot and Demonstration Project, which was meant to develop a model for a health insurance program. That was in 1994. Over the life cycle of the DHP, what was observed to be happening was that the population was in fact migrating away from public health towards the private sector. 20 years on from that time, Uganda still has no national health insurance scheme. So we're at square one. Moving on to more recent examples of incompetence to safely borrow money, and that's my primary argument. Nobody's saying debt is wrong, and no one is saying it's useless. But you need to be able to borrow safely and to borrow responsibly, which is not the case at the moment. So what happened with SAP1 in agro-processing, having privatized public enterprises on the principle that the public sector is no good at business? We used to hear that a lot. Uganda has gone back to investing in parastatals, and predictably with little success. Briefly, there were 6 agro-processing companies established: Kisoro Potato Processing, Chia and Pyrethrum Factory, Uganda-Egypt Food Security, which is a meat processor, Soroti Fruit, Mtungamo Juice, and Yumbe Mango. And they all closed. And they all closed within a few years of being launched. And Yumbe Mango closed within 4 months after sustaining fatal losses. Kisoro Potato closed owing farmers 180 million shillings for the potatoes, and they closed just after receiving a 700 million shilling bailout. And basically, the story continues. There were other agricultural projects like the Pride Rice Scheme. The idea was to increase the coverage of rice grown in Uganda and improve food security. When that project closed and was reviewed, it was found that rice production had actually fallen by 79%. Then there's the Coffee Development, either authority or organization, which distributes an improved coffee cultivar to increase coffee coverage. And after review by the relevant authority, it was found that only 42% of the seedlings germinate. Um, Lastly, in agriculture, there's the Presidential Banana Development Initiative, and that was to find ways of using bananas in a different way. The powdered bananas, banana flour for making cake and bread and various things like that. And it was audited and found to be riddled with corruption. And in fact, after the program closed and it was removed from the budget, it continued to receive payments from the Treasury, despite not having a vote. So, in the health sector, and this is the last one on the last section on the government competence in running businesses and that sort of thing. In the health sector, we had the Lubowa Specialized Hospital, which was meant to be the flagship of Uganda's health tourism income stream. It is 4 years late, and until recently it was still at foundation level. And in any case, Tanzania has stolen the market by commissioning the President Mkapa Hospital to deliver specialized services. Then we had vaccine development. 31 billion shillings was invested in developing vaccines. One was a COVID vaccine grant, and to the Presidential Scientific Initiative on Epidemics, or PRESIDE. I've looked, but candidates do not show up on the EU clinical trials register, despite the expenditure and despite assurances that we had 3 candidates for trial. So that didn't work either. It was found by an audit, a special audit, that funds were dished out to various entities, including the banana development people. And a lot of those entities, if not all, are not able to account fully for them. So the last investment in health was it was also pharmaceutical. We wanted to become self-sufficient in pharmaceuticals, and that self-sufficiency meant in building pharmaceutical firms. But our investment didn't go to building pharmaceutical firms. It went to bailing out a failing pharmaceutical firm, which was either in receivership or close to it. I saw some of their property being audited, being auctioned in the papers, and they've managed to score a bailout from Parliament. So that's that for the competence to borrow safely. And then I'd like to move on to corruption and wasteful expenditure by public officials. The austerity that our Kenyan colleague has described so well, the austerity required of the general population in both Kenya and Uganda, is in stark contrast with the lavish lifestyles enjoyed by their leaders and their patronage circles. President Ruto has promised to remove wasteful expenditure from the budget, beginning with the renovation of his and his deputies' official residences. In Uganda, meanwhile, the Speaker of Parliament spent, or is going to spend, or has been approved to receive 532 million shillings. That's $143,000 on fencing and lighting her private home, not her official residence. The taxpayer also covers her electricity to the tune of 4 million shillings or $1,000 per month. And the president's household, State House, is reliably reported to spend $2 billion per day. $2 billion is the equivalent, 2 billion shillings, sorry, per day. 2 billion shillings is the equivalent of the construction costs of a secondary school. I can never believe these figures, but I have to find out if it's 2 billion a day or a month. But that 2 billion will build you a secondary school. Parliament is equally culpable. Billions are spent on attending the annual East African Parliamentary Games, while thousands of school children don't have sports facilities or even desks. Ugandan members of parliament across the board have accepted random grants from unclear sources. They accept a 200 million shilling grant for an SUV each every 5 years, and tens of millions as inducements to pass supplementary budgets. However, having given you those details, I want to caution us that it's denouncing corruption and incompetence has become a national pastime, at least in Uganda. In order to bring about change, the country needs to go further. Uganda, prompted by Kenya, plans to protest the cost of living and also corruption in parliament and the executive. And the plan is for a peaceful march to parliament. But like Kenya's protest, there is a risk of state brutality. So we can finish with the second part, which is reckless lending by the IMF and the World Bank. Knowing that a borrowing country is run by corrupt leaders who would sooner use loans for regime preservation and their own personal comfort than human development, why do the IMF and the World Bank continue to lend to them? And the answer is because banks lend. That's their business. So the only remaining question is whether or not they fear.
Hopefully, we have a few minutes to round up.
Yes, about 5 minutes. Is that okay? Right. So, very briefly, they continue to lend regardless of whether a country is competent to pay or whether a government is capable of paying. Because the premise is that a country cannot go bankrupt. Money will be recovered. Recently, Uganda considered taxing rainwater harvest tanks. And this isn't a fantasy because Israel does it to Palestinians in the West Bank. Rainwater has been deemed to be public property. And China went the whole hog, and Uganda, for certain Chinese loans, has agreed to surrender any public assets to China in the event that we default. So, without going into all the other examples of IMF malfeasance, I'd like to just conclude with charting the way forward. I think that there has to be, in the short term, there has to be stop-loss measures. And in the NUP manifesto, we identified 3 trillion shillings of potential savings. That exercise needs to be repeated. And we need to use the mechanisms at our disposal to pressure public servants to give up allowances and benefits to which they're not legally or morally entitled. Because at the moment, when candidates are being selected, they're not asked about these issues. They're asked about personal issues or its ethnic ties and things, but they're not asked about debt. They're not asked about human development. And then there needs to be a suspension of nugatory expenditure. For example, decorations and refreshments and offices. Every public office these days seems to.
1 minute.
Sorry?
One
Yeah.
minute. Yes.
Every office seems to have a DST connection, so we can remove those. And then in the long term, the most difficult thing to achieve is going to be a debt audit. We need to put together an non-partisan, broad-based committee to audit the public debt. And any public debt that was wasted or stolen must be repudiated. It's the only source of money without borrowing more to finance old debts. And I think we can stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the very detailed experience from Uganda on dealing with structural adjustment and what, and the connections for comrades from Kenya manifest as to what happens when a country takes on structural adjustment policies. We're going to move westward to Ghana now, but also in terms of time, we're going to move backward to the 1960s in Ghana and sort of trace Ghana's progression or regression from the 1960s to date. The next speaker, Amodani Gariba, is a Pan-Africanist and Nkrumahist political activist based in Accra, who currently works in the office of the Fighter General of the Economic Fighters League, where he helps coordinate the activities of the movement. Fighters, since 2016, have been fighting against the political duopoly in Ghana, which has put Ghana deep into the web of neoliberalism. Amodani Gariba is also a local grassroots political organizer, helping drive better political inclusion for people deprived of participation in local government. So the presentation Gariba is going to make will enable us to see the connections among colonialism, neo-colonialism, and what has now been referred to as neoliberalism. Take it on, Amodani.
I hope I'm audible enough. I'm very happy to be here on your platform, speaking to the audience here. I'm representing the Economic Fighters League, and I would like to dive in straight to business. Right. So first, I would like to start by answering the question that what did Kwame Nkrumah mean by neo-colonialism? And here I'm going to refer to his book, that he wrote in 1964. The title of the book is Neo-Colonialism, the Last Stage of Imperialism. So when you refer to the book, on the second paragraph of the introduction of the book, he defines neo-colonialism, and he defines it as such, and I quote: "The essence of neo-colonialism is that the state which is subject to it is in theory independent and has all the outward trappings of international sovereignty. However, in reality, its economic system and thus its political policy is directed from outside." So this is how Kwame Nkrumah defined neo-colonialism in 1964. And in fact, we are told that because he wrote this book exposing the workings, the trappings, the strategy and the tactics of neo-colonialism, that was one of the reasons why the CIA and British and other European intelligence conspired to remove him from power. But again, we see what Kwame Nkrumah talking about here manifest across Africa, across all of Africa, in terms of the economic policies of countries, and in fact, even the politics. I can say that the libertarian multi-party democracy that is in practice in Africa today is a direct imposition on Africa, which is neo-colonialism, as Nkrumah would put it. So, away from that, in what ways have successful governments in Ghana adopted neo-colonial policies since Nkrumah was deposed as the president of Ghana? You know, one thing about Kwame Nkrumah is that we all know that he was widely known as an African nationalist and a Pan-Africanist. But what is less known about him is that he was a consummate socialist, and he put this into practice immediately he was elected to lead government business in 1951, and subsequently in 1952 when he became the prime minister of the country, throughout to 1960 when he became the first elected president of the country, up until the time he was illegally overthrown in 1966. He put socialism in practice in the country. In fact, socialism was enshrined in the first constitution of the country. I'm talking about the 1960 constitution of the country. Nkrumah made it clear that Ghana, coming out of colonialism, was going to chart the path of socialism as a way of developing the country instead of capitalism. So, what 6 years of his rule as prime minister, and then uh, 9 years. I think 9 years as 9 years as prime minister and 6 years as president of the country. He was able to build more than 350 state-owned factories and enterprises that were employing Ghanaians and employing migrant workers from other parts of Africa. So before 1966, unemployment was zero. There was zero unemployment in Ghana. But not only that, there was free universal education from primary to the university level. And you have a lot of elders here in Ghana who tell you they benefited from that policy of Kwame Nkrumah. There was also free healthcare, free universal healthcare during Kwame Nkrumah's regime from 1960 to 1966. And so, what happened when Kwame Nkrumah was illegally overthrown? The soldiers that took power from him, I'm talking about the National Liberation, they call themselves the National Liberation Council, but Kwame Nkrumah rebranded them as the Notorious Liars Council. What they did was to sell most of the state-owned enterprises and companies that were set up by Kwame Nkrumah. And once this, not only selling, there were those that were closed down and those that were yet to be completed abandoned, right? And once this was done, unemployment skyrocketed, and then you had, for the first time in the history of Ghana, crime becoming the order of the day, because people have nothing to do. They have to resort to crime to make ends meet. But the interesting thing about this is that these soldiers knew nothing about how to govern a country. And so they were taking their economic advice and policies directly from the IMF. And IMF was the entity that gave the advice for the state entities or state enterprises to be sold to private hands. Aside that, in 1969, Ghana reverted briefly to the Westminster parliamentary democracy model, and this is to highlight, the political side of neo-colonialism, So, but the real trust of IMF came in 1983 when the former president Jerry John Rawlings took over made a coup and took over from Hilary Liman, who was an elected president. When he took over in 1981, 2 years later, he went to the IMF and allowed them to play a very pronounced role in the economy of the country. In fact, in the 1992 Constitution of Ghana, the current Constitution of Ghana, you can see the footprint of the IMF everywhere. particularly in Article 35 that talks about the directive policy, the directives of state policy, where it states that the private sector is going to be the engine of growth of the economy. And we know that, I mean, since the time of Kwame Nkrumah, the indigenous private sector of Ghana is very small. And so if the constitution of the country is saying that the private sector is going to be the engine of growth of the economy, what it really means is that political policymakers are going to open the space for foreign private capital to come and exploit both the natural resources and the labor of Ghanaians. And that is what happened. So as a result, the remaining factories from the Nkrumah eras that were operating were sold. Every one last of them were sold to foreign capital and, you know, indigenous people, cronies and friends of government, political players, and what have you. So now, currently in the country, everything from utilities to manufacturing to banking, etc., is in the hands of foreign capital. You know, so this is how bad the situation is in the country. You know, so and when you look at the similarities between, you know, the economic policies as it pertains here in Ghana and what it is in Kenya today, you see a lot of similarities. For example, Ghana and Kenya are both, you know, heavy in Eurobonds. From, I think, 2007 or so, Ghana has consistently gone to European capital markets to borrow at excessively high rates, you know, some at 8, 9, 10%, which is unsustainable, in fact. And not only Eurobonds, but high on Chinese debts and other forms of foreign private rapacious capital. So that is one of the that is one situation which is similar to both countries. Another one is that both countries are on the brink of default because we've taken up so much loans, so much debt, and as Mary Serumaga was saying, that some of these debts went into projects that were not viable. And so in this instance, if the projects are not viable, who bears the cost? In this instance, the IMF and the World Bank and the private capital lenders push it on the Ghanaian and Kenyan taxpayers. But we've come to the point where we cannot pay the debt anymore. So we are on the brink of default. In fact, Ghana defaulted on its loans. You see, so and now both countries are trying to restructure their debt, and as a result of that, they are both at the IMF, you know, seeking, you know, support to be able to restructure their debt. And IMF, as usual, has placed enormous economic and political conditionalities for giving economic bailouts to both Ghana and Kenya. And we've seen how it has resulted in Kenya's 7 days of rage. I was reading that IMF basically wrote the Kenyan finance bill. I mean, and here in Ghana, prior to us going to the IMF, the government imposed on Ghanaians what it calls the electronic transfer levy, where if you want to send money to somebody on mobile money, the government is going to tax you. And Ghanaians opposed it, but the government did not think. They imposed it by fiat, and there was nothing we could do about it. In fact, the government proposed VAT on electricity, and had the Labour Trade Union Congress and some sections of Ghanaian not gotten up to oppose this, it would have been imposed on Ghanaian as well. And we know these are all part of the conditionalities of the IMF, so that Ghana would receive, you know, tranches of money as part of its bailout program. Now, so as fighters, what are we doing against neoliberalism in Ghana? You know, if you've been following fighters for a while, you know that in 2019, we were set up in 2016, but we've been engaged in one struggle or the other. But in 2019, the Parliament of Ghana decided to build, a grandiose, new parliament building for themselves. And it came at a time that the country was facing enormous economic pressure. The Economic Fighters League felt it was unnecessary and had to go. So we started the drop that chamber campaign in 2019, where our leader, Commander-in-Chief Ernesto Yeboah, went to storm the Parliament of Ghana and basically shouted on the MPs to drop that chamber. Even though he suffered, he suffered some brutalities from the security forces. At the end of the day, they had to drop the chamber, so it didn't come off. In 2020, fighters told Ghanaians that hold your votes, because we believe that the agents of neoliberalism in Ghana are NPP and NDC, the two major political parties in the country. And so how we can fight neoliberalism, one way we can fight neoliberalism is by fighting these two parties. So we told Ghanaians that you don't have to hold your power, don't vote for these parties in the 2020 elections. And about 5 million Ghanaians did not vote in that elections. In 2021, fighters galvanized the youth, the youth of the country in what we call the Fix the Country movement. That resulted in the Fix the Country demonstration in 2021. It was a very historic moment for Ghana, because for the first time in so many years, you have youth that hitherto were unconcerned about politics trooping to the street to protest issues of political and economic nature. It was very unprecedented. And in 2024, there's going to be another election in Ghana in December. This time around, we are telling Ghanaians that vote for anybody but NPP and NDC. So we are telling Ghanaians there are a plethora of options on the ballot, but don't go for NDC or NPP. Go for any other option. And so this is the current struggle that we are waging as at now against neoliberalism in the country. So, Comrade Boy, I would like to end my presentation here. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for that presentation, and appreciated you making very important connections as we're trying to do throughout this discussion today between Kenya and Uganda, highlighting first of all the neoliberalism and what it means today. And talking about the finance bill and the in Kenya and the various movements that have been also taking place in Ghana. We've been following Economic Fighters League, and hopefully we can also drop their social media in the chat as well. So you can also follow some of the campaigns that they've been involved in, Fix the Country, Drop That Chamber, and other initiatives. And so really appreciating the connections that we have made, the historical connections, the connections across the continent. And now we're coming back to Kenya, and really going to do a deep dive here to the current moment. As we can see from all the reflections that we've had, these movements are focused on the poor, right? They're not taxing the rich, they're not attacking the rich, but really the IMF and all the imperialist policies are really targeting creating hunger and and really attacking everyday people across our nations. And so how are the working class, how are the proletariat and the underclass reacting to this current status quo that has become the poverty and want in so many African nations? What tools are they using? How does this change or shape what we know about struggles and resistance? So we're going to Kenya, we're going to speak to some people. We have two speakers. The first is Faith Kasina. Faith is the coordinator of the Kayole Social Justice Center in Nairobi, Kenya. And she is going to speak about Kenyan urban poor and the resistance against Ruto's economic policies. Welcome, Comrade Faith. We look forward to hearing from you.
Hi. Greetings, comrades. I hope you can hear me. First of all, just to connect what we were talking about and the fact that today is Sabasaba, we were holding a concert today at Guru Park one of the places, if you're connecting from the first speaker, where the mothers of political prisoners camped to fight for the release of their sons. Today we were holding a ceremony there, a concert there, to celebrate the lives of the people who were killed, and were not only mourning but also celebrating their heroic sacrifice for this country, but also the fact that they represent the brutality of this state, and the violations that have continued to happen over time from regime to regime. Looking at Moi's regime, Uhuru Kenyatta's regime, and now Ruto's regime, the violence has continued to be meted on the poor and innocent young people. So yes, and that also really connects to what I will talk about, the fact that the social justice centers, I come from the social justice centers movement, and the social justice centers movement began due to the police violence on informal settlements in Kenya, police abuse of power, extrajudicial killings, and forced disappearance. That is what began. Really made the social justice centers start organizing around informal settlements. And I think one of the things that even as we look at the organizing right now, we realize that most of the people that also came out are also from informal settlements and the slums. Because when these policies are being passed, they're the majority of people who are affected. And like the previous speakers have spoken, that removal of subsidies, support on education, on healthcare, that really affects mostly the poor people who cannot afford to go to private hospitals. And that is how the urban centers, especially slums and ghettos, have started organizing around the basic of the human needs that they would need to to actually go by each day: healthcare, education, food, water. Um, and some of the campaigns, I will just touch on some of the campaigns and how the urban people in Kenya are organizing. One is through forming social and political movements. Over the past 5 years, over the past 10 years, we've seen political and social movements come up from the issues that are affecting the people. Some are touching on political sovereignty, some are touching on social justice, others are touching on human rights, and so they are all playing the same role on towards the achievement of dignity and justice of the people of Kenya. Um, and also touching on some of them is campaigns. There are some campaigns that people have kept on pushing, and one of them is Njaa Revolution. Most of the people in Kenya cannot afford 3 meals a day, especially the people in the slums and informal settlements. And so the Njaa Revolution campaign was focuses first of all on the retrogressive seed laws that the government has passed, and one is the criminalization of our indigenous seed laws, that we cannot plant we cannot exchange our indigenous seeds, because we have now to buy food seeds from seed companies. And also we look at who does this benefit, but also how does it affect us, especially the poor people who cannot afford to buy the seeds first of all, and the fact that they cannot. We as Africans, we come from a place where we exchange goods. When you have some seeds, we are able to exchange. So these seed laws really criminalize the exchange of seed laws. Another one is the Unga Revolution. Um, the Unga Revolution campaign that was focusing on the high cost of living. This is a previous campaign. And also the Occupy Parliament that has happened like 10 years ago. And now we've also seen this year, we saw Occupy affordable houses. The government in Kenya has been building affordable houses, but these affordable houses are not for the poor people, because they are being sold at they are very expensive, the poor people are not able to buy them. They are not basically for the working class. They are built for the bourgeois people who can only afford these houses. So when floods came, when floods hit Kenya, and most of the places that were affected are the informal settlements and slums, the government reacted by evicting and demolishing people's houses without looking at how to resettle them, how to give them how to support them actually to get back on their knees. So when people's houses got demolished and people got evicted, people started a campaign that we need to occupy affordable houses that have already been built by the government, and no one lives in them because the government is waiting to actually sell them to people. But who is the government building these houses for? That is what people were questioning. And now, previously, there was the finance bill 2022-2023 that people came out to actually oppose and to even reject, but the government went ahead and still passed it. But this finance bill this year is what made people get very mad, because one, in the midst of the crisis, evictions, unemployment, extrajudicial killings, food insecurity, the government still, and even the high taxes, because when they passed the finance bill 2023-2024, everything went high. Education is very high. The doctors are not getting paid. Still, even with misappropriation of finances that are there, the little money, the taxes they're able to get, they misappropriate them. They either and they put up offices for the spouses of the president, the spouses of the vice president, the spouses of the prime cabinet, the prime minister. So that does not, which misappropriation, and still you want to tax people to death, while this money is not going towards easing the life of people, like making life easy for them, or even for them to access dignity. And that is what sparked the uprising that we've seen around reject finance bill. And these uprisings have been over time, and I will add on another one, which is Sabasaba March for Lives, that has always continued to be organized around different issues, and one of them, different themes, and one of the themes has been stop killing us. There has been a lot of police brutality, enforced disappearance, extrajudicial killings, but also not only Kenya is not killing its people through the bullet, it's killing its people through lack of healthcare, killing its people through malnutrition. So this Sabasaba campaign has always been on stop killing us, stop killing us, stop killing us, because most of the things that are facing the urban people are just basically the accessibility of the basic of human needs, because most of them live very lives that are not dignified. I come from a place called Kayole, one of the informal settlements, and one of the things that we struggle with is police abuse of power and just the accessibility of water. We access water hours in a week, so those are some of the things that the poor, that the urban centers in Nairobi are organizing around, but also just not only organizing. I know there is this conversation that the reject finance bill uprising in Kenya are leaderless, but that is not true, because there are people who came out and told people to come out, and also the fact that the reason why people are saying they are leaderless is because over time we've seen leaders, once they are to people trust them as their leaders, they go and negotiate and throw every other person under the bus for their own interest. So the reason why people have come out to say they are leaderless is because they don't want to be compromised. They don't want people to be bought. They don't want to put other people at risk. It's also to protect the people who have been giving direction, the people who have been offering direction in the ongoing uprisings. that does not mean then people are leaderless. That is just to say that even if you want us to talk, even if you want to have a conversation with us, we are not talking. You will not talk to a few of us. If you have to talk to us, you have to talk through fulfilling the demands of the people. So I think I have touched on the few things, the ways that the urban poor in Kenya, urban people in Kenya have been organizing, and one has been through running campaigns. The other one is creating social and political movements. The other one is doing civic and political education. The reason why I'm saying political education is it's one thing to be told this is your right as enshrined in your constitution, but it's another thing to be told that this is the political direction that this country should take. And one of the things that we also do in political education is to break down every other corruption case, the money that has been stolen. If it's 2 billion, what would have that 2 billion done for the people? It would have provided healthcare to this amount of people. It would have provided sanitary towels to this amount of people. Because now even the government, while in Kenya we still have menstrual poverty, government wants in this finance bill that the people are rejecting, government was adding taxes on sanitary towels. Was in Kenya right now there are no vaccines for children, and the government still has money to allocate to renewal of state houses. So this issue was not only about also just to clear that it was not totally on reject finance bill. It was to reject every other bad thing that is happening in Kenya, and the fact that the leaders do not care about the people's interest, they put their interests first, and the fact that our president is ready to auction Kenya for his own interest, even from what we've seen him do, So it has been a culmination of other organizations, of other activities and events that have culminated to these massive uprisings that we've continued to see in during this conversation on reject finance bill.
Wow. Thank you so much, Faith. Really, really appreciating you bringing up the wider struggle and a lot of the politics of what's going on the streets. So you spoke about the Inja Revolution. You spoke about the human necessities that are not being met, and it really touched me when you talked about like how Kenya is not killing people necessarily through bullets, although they're actually killing people with bullets as well, but also killing them through hunger, through lack of medications. Shocking to hear about how there are no vaccinations for children, but money for, building state houses, money for the wives of politicians and the political class. And this is really for me as someone who, as a Nigerian also, and also going back to some of our previous Pan-Africanist schools, I see so many resonances, and hopefully we'll have time to discuss that later with what happened with NSARS and what is happening in Kenya right now, the topics of leaderlessness and also being a tactic to protect people who are actually leaders but might be targeted by the state. And also seeing the wider struggle, having one particular hashtag or name, but actually that hashtag or name being emblematic of a much being indicative of a much wider struggle for many other different things. So thank you so much, Faith, and hopefully there'll be questions that will come back to you during the question period. So again, thank you. We're going to continue listening to how Gen Z is organizing. The next speaker we have is Comrade Sungo Oyo. Sorry, I please pronounce your name correctly when you come on. Comrade Sungo is a writer and coordinator of UMWAMCO, the Pan-African Popular Pedagogy Collective, and he's also the national spokesperson of another organization, which I'm not going to try to pronounce. I'm sorry, I didn't have time to learn this, but you can tell us more. And they are going to be speaking about the digital power of Gen Z, Organizing Against Neoliberalism Today. So welcome, and we look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you, Nandre. Hopefully, I've also pronounced your name in the right way. You did justice to my name. My name is Sungoyo. I'm a writer and an organizer with a political movement called Kongamano la Mapinduzi.
So it seems as if we have lost sound from you.
Hello? Hello?
Okay.
Can
Okay,
you hear
great.
me?
Yeah. Yes, we can hear you now. We can hear you now. Thank you.
Sorry about that. I have poor network, which is why my video is off. But I was just saying that the protests need to be looked at in totality. The protests generally arise out of tough economic conditions that our people and our communities are experiencing. The protests do not arise out of a vacuum. The protests are actually a manifestation of what is happening in society and the suffering that people in society are undergoing. But what is Kenya itself? Kenya is a neo-colonial state.
Yes, and again we're experienced.
Reject
Sorry,
this finance bill.
can
Hello?
you we missed what you said, so if you can, sorry, just try to start again. We're just hoping you can.
Sorry.
Okay.
Sorry. I was saying at the beginning of these protests, the protests were generally about the finance bill. That these are regressive taxes which you are imposing on us. You are imposing taxes on bread, that is value added tax on bread. You are saying you want to impose taxes on cooking oil. You are saying you have already implemented a new tax on our personal income tax of 35%. Like taxation has risen across board, but we are not getting services in return. That was the cry of the people. Because if these taxes are to be implemented, then the state needed to give the people services in return. Healthcare, including programs which were the state previously covered costs were imposed. On education, the Presidential Committee on Education imposed a 300% increase in university fees, and there is many additional fees at high school and primary school levels. Uh, and so people are generally angry because people are really going through a hard time, especially at a moment when the economy has not fully recovered from the COVID pandemic, which in itself I think is a discussion for another day. But the economy is doing badly. You're overtaxing people, not giving people services in return. State officials and politicians are living luxurious lifestyles, and you have the IMF coming in and imposing structural adjustment programs like they did in the 80s. Though nowadays they use different language for it, austerity measures, and a lot of things. But basically, what has happened is that there has been a very significant drop in terms of the quality of life, in terms of how people are able to get along. I was saying at the beginning, they started with anti-finance bill protests, but then there was a strategic escalation because they soon after moved to a process of Ruto must go, which was good because now it moved beyond the bill. But Ruto in itself is also a representation of a system. And at this point, I think that the most important thing for the protests and the movements and the people in their forward, how would I say it, how to have a real systemic change. Because Ruto is a symptom of a system. Ruto is only a signal of that system which has deprived and humiliated our people for years and years and decades. And our people are not asking for much. Our people have very simple demands. We want education, we want healthcare, we want housing, we want dignity. Actually, that is at the most basic level. What our people are asking for at this particular moment in history is to be accorded dignity. But at the same time, of course, Kenya does not exist in a vacuum, like I said. But what is Kenya? Kenya is a neo-colonial state. And the neo-colonial state is created in the image of the colonial state. And I'll not go much into neo-colonialism because my comrade from Ghana who spoke earlier outlined it really well. And when a state is created in the image of neo-colonialism, it operates on the logics of a colonial state. Extraction, deprivation, like we take everything. At this moment, Ruto is saying he rode to power on the backs of the hustlers, the backs of the most marginalized segments of society. And he said, we are going to create opportunities. We are going to do this, do this, do this. Now he's saying, we are going to export you. You go abroad, work. We have deals with these governments. But what that means is that when our young people go abroad, the most active segments of our population, when they go abroad, they are working and building economies which are not our own. And which means that the opposite of it is that we are underdeveloping our economy because we are taking away our labor. The land is already gone because the political elite, the bourgeoisie in Kenya, have grabbed all forms of land. Nairobi had floods 2 months ago. The state carried out demolitions of the so-called informal settlements. They call them informal settlements, the slums, but they cannot be informal because these are people's settlements. The state calling them informal settlements is to informalize them because the people who live there are not informal. They're African people, they're actual people. And so the state, in informalizing people's settlements and having a basis to destroy it, made hundreds of thousands of people homeless in a span of a few weeks. And then a finance bill came to parliament. I mean, if people, of course, people are already organizing against this finance bill because it is very anti-people. And our historical responsibility is to defend the territory of life. Our generational responsibility at this time is to continue the struggle, which was started by those who came before us. And so the people are already struggling. But when the demolitions happen, I think there is an anger which arose from
Yes,
for us. Hello?
Sorry, we just lost you for a second. You're back.
Oh, sorry. No, I was saying it's like the way Mao says, sometimes the organizations can be ahead of the people, and sometimes the people can be ahead of the organizations. The most important thing is for the people and their organizations in their mass-based dimensions to be able to move forward at the same pace, to march into history. And when we look at Kenya historically, because the debt question, Ruto is saying we are imposing these taxes to enable the country pay debt. The debt question has a historical dimension to it. First and foremost, because Kenya was a settler colony. And the way in which a settler colony operates is that it takes and takes and takes, and a lot of people are dispossessed. When the War for National Liberation broke out in 1952, when the Kenya Land and Freedom Army decided that we are going to determine our own history and ink it through our means of struggle. Of course, it was an armed struggle which claimed lives. And you know, the British imprisoned over 1 million Kenyan people. They put them in what they call villages, which were basically concentration camps, like the Boers did in South Africa during apartheid. Basically, 1 million people are imprisoned, and this is 10 years. This is 10 years after World War II. So it's like 10 years after, less than 10 years actually after World War II. 10 years after the world had seen the horrors of the concentration camps in Germany, but the British implemented the same in Kenya. And so there is that bitterness which arises from that historical epoch. But when Kenya, the first government, interim government, just before full independence, took over power, the government of Britain, government of West Germany, and the World Bank advanced Kenya a loan of £2 million for Kenya to buy back the land from the settlers who are living. The settlers, remember, had never bought the land from anyone. They took it through the gun. They killed and exterminated our people. Kenya had to take a loan of £2 million.
We are experiencing more tech.
Hello?
Yes.
Hello?
Please go ahead. We ended at 2 million. Kenyan taken a loan.
Yes. Kenya took a loan of £2 million from the World Bank, from West Germany, and Britain, those three governments. And that is, if you are to convert it to its full value today, it's billions of money. And so Kenya finished paying this loan in the 80s. And Kenya has also been taking multitudes of loans from these multilateral institutions. So whether you are looking at the loans taken in the 70s and 80s, and the interest that accrued, and how the state has struggled to repay back this loan. But then the state is led by a comprador class which produces nothing, but which is rich and lives very fancy lifestyles. And so basically we are led by a group of middlemen, like brokers, who basically go and negotiate how to sell us out. And from the 80s with the structural adjustment programs, because before that you could study up to university, healthcare was free and all these things. After the 80s, then the costs are added to this. But then what happened last year, 2023, and at the end of 2022 and beginning of 2023, is that based on one of the loans that Kenya had taken in August of 2022, the conditionalities of that loan, the structural conditionalities, if you study them, it has three main points. It talks about shoring up the financial base, and basically what it translates to in our reality as a people is taxes. And that is why you see university education rising by 300%, the cost. You see government not investing in healthcare. You see government investing more towards war and towards acquiring weapons. And you see them now reaching a deal with the American government to send our police force to Haiti. While within Kenya itself, things are boiling. And the people are so angry, and that is why the people decide to march and to protest. And the government says, we will not listen to you. This bill must pass. And when the people storm parliament, the government says, now we are ready to listen to you. And of course, the government gives a few concessions. But these concessions are so little that a material impact in the lives of our people. What we need is a redefining of the whole of society. And Cabral taught us, and every day his memory reminds us that the people are our mountains. The people are the motive force of history. It is the people who determine the direction of society and how society will move. But what have the Kenyan people said at this point? They have said they want to be free from both structures of internal oppression and structures of external domination. And I think what is happening in society at the moment is that we have achieved a qualitative leap, which doesn't arise out of a vacuum, like my comrade Faith Kasena said. It arises out of the work that different organizations and different mass movements have been doing over the past years. This is the visible part of that work. But then, it also is not something which should carry us or excite us, because I think it only marks the beginning of a protracted process. And all of us who have studied the laws of social development know that struggle is not an electric switch. It is not a radio. It is not something you turn on and off. Struggle is a protracted process. And given how the state has reacted and the killings that have happened, I think we really need to be aware and think of how within the revolutionary process we counter elements of counter-revolution, both within the movements and within structures like the state. If at this particular moment we are to talk of the digital sphere and the contribution it has made, it has been fundamental, like people organizing themselves online and showing up and doing things like literally shifting the balance of power overnight. It is something fundamental. But I think the thing that's most key is to think of how the different movements and the different organizations have been able to connect online and offline forms of organizing. Because the digital sphere for us is a tool, and we must never confuse the tool with the actual work. It is a tool to enable us connect 1 and B, to connect A and B, or 1 and 2, to move certain things forward, to figure certain things out, to stay connected. But it is not, in itself, it is not organizing. In saying that, that is not to rubbish the digital sphere, because I think it has been the most decisive element of this particular moment of organizing in Kenya. Because we are not slaves, we are not anyone's slave.
Hello, you're losing you again.
Hello?
You can also
Oh, sorry. I think it's my network. But I was saying, when Ruto now talks about exporting labor, we have to see that the people have said that we are not slaves, we are not anyone's slave. I mean, those who came before us engaged in a struggle for national liberation, so we wouldn't go through what they have done. And for a lot of our young people, they think it's better to stay in the country and do what they can do, like create something for themselves. And our people are not asking for anything. Our people are not asking for a holiday to the Bahamas. Our people are asking for healthcare. Our people are asking for right to food. At the same time, because of the connection between the IMF and the multinational corporations, especially in the food sector, the Ruto government says, now you can't keep seeds, you can't exchange seeds. Giving seeds to your neighbor is a crime. How will they then grow food? They're saying you have to come to our stores and buy food. I mean, we have to look at this thing at the most basic level, at the level of dignity. And we have to be clear, like the Pan-Africanists who came before us were. In the 1945 Congress in Manchester, Nkrumah was there, Kenyatta was there. We'll talk about Kenyatta another day, but Kenyatta was there. George Padma was there. All these Pan-African figures were there. And they were very clear about 3 questions. Who are our friends? The masses of our people. Who are our enemies? The colonial empire and the structures that support it. What must be done? We must create mass-based parties as the dimensions of our organizing. And so today, in our organizing, and in the moments we find ourselves, I think the key questions to ask again, and of course which are very clear, but which we must always remind ourselves of, is who are our friends? Of course, it's still the masses of our people. Who are our enemies? Our enemies are structures of exploitation, structures of exclusion, the structures and institutions and people who every day humiliate our people, condemn them to poverty, condemn them to death, and all these things. What must be done? That is the fundamental question. We must organize, and the only effective form of organizing in this day and age is organizing the people in their mass-based dimensions. Because, like I said, the people are the motive force of history.
Yes.
The people The people are the determinants of history, and so we have to organize across all spheres. And I think what's happening in Kenya shouldn't also be viewed in isolation. As I finish, sorry for speaking for so long. As I finish, it mustn't be viewed in isolation. I think across the continent there has been a wave uh, uh, over a number of years, and maybe at this moment it's just arriving in the east. We saw the feast must fall in Southern Africa. We've seen what's happening in Western Africa with Burkina and all these countries. We saw in North Africa over a decade ago. And I think something is just starting in the east. But it must be viewed within the whole African context.
Yeah.
It must be viewed in terms of what it means at this particular moment in history. It must be viewed as a struggle for dignity. It must be viewed as a continuation of the unfinished African liberation struggle. The struggle that Nyerere and other contemporaries of theirs started has never ended. And we all know that. And so for me, this is just one phase of that overall struggle. And the key question for me is, how do we move from this moment towards a movement which then becomes of historical significance because of the gains it is able to achieve, to enable our people to achieve. Many thanks, and sorry I have to run. I might not be able to stay around for long. I'm attending to something here, but I think these conversations are really important, and we are at a decisive moment, but we need to really be clear. We have to be clear and to figure out how we want to march into history, comrades. We have a lot of questions to answer. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sungu, for that. We're going to run because we're running out of time. And we're going to go back to the international sphere now. We're going to briefly hear about what is at stake for the US. We've already learned from previous speakers that not only was the United States ambassador to Kenya heavily interested in the passing of the finance bill, but Congress people, congressmen and women from the United States were present in the Kenyan parliament while that bill was passing. What is it that the US wants with Kenya, in particular with this bill? Next to take us through this is Abdullahi Boru. Abdullahi Boru is a seasoned analyst, but also activist who has worked in various countries in Eastern Africa and the Horn of Africa, and is going to explain to us what is at stake for the United States. Take it away, Abdullahi.
No, thank you so much. I hope I am clear. First of all, I think it is an absolute pleasure to be with wonderful crowd like this. So from the time that sometimes one of the challenges with the people on the left, and especially the progressive, we hardly sit back and enjoy. We hardly sit back and say, look, these are the wins that we've had. Sometimes I feel like we like to be in the glorious defeat. Oh no, we reach very close with the Occupy movement. Indeed happened. We beat ourselves, we sing songs and we go on. The same with Occupy movement with the Black Lives Matter. But this is a very important moment, and I cannot thank enough everybody from the beginning that went ahead and dropped wisdom. We learned, and we just demonstrated that there is, a great deal of historicization of what is going on in the country. Everybody is crying for justice. scratching their head. Where did this movement come from? This movement draws from the rich vein of, organizing that is done online, offline, multi-generational, across various class and people. And that is something beautiful to watch, and this is where it's come to. Secondly, I think contextualizing. I think sometimes, not all, but many Kenyans, we tend to have a blinker as an exceptional country in the region. And as such, we tend to be more insular, more inward looking, but peppering this with what is going on elsewhere is a really useful exercise for us Kenyans to have a cosmopolitan outlook that Kenyans had, at the beginning, the dreams of people like Pio Gama Pinto and the rest, so that we'll be able to contribute to this. I just want to use 2-3 minutes of my time and donate the rest of the time to quick question and answer, because a lot of the ground has been covered. I just want to make one important thing here is that Kenya has always been, if you will, a settler outpost. It's always been that. I think once you get Kenya through settler outpost framework, everything tends to fall in place. Otherwise, you just get moved around. You see the police. The police are nothing but the instrument of this settler state. And also, just if you go back to the genesis of what today we call Kenya, it was part of the British, the Imperial British East African Company that owned it, I think, from 1888 to 1893. After that, it reverted to the British colonial empire. And since then, and I'll use the Kenyatta period, where until 1989, Kenya was really the darling of the British establishment, right? Kenya and especially Kenyatta, who the British made up to be this radical guy who had this, the British worked so hard to create an image of Kenyatta that never existed. Kenyatta was just a very useful opportunist in how he rode the Mau Mau, the moment and everything. But for the British, he became a very useful vehicle to channel everything that they wanted Kenya want to be. Kenya that is not just a colonial outpost, but also a plantation. The whip is the batons that the police has. And Kenyatta cultivated that relationship because it suited both of them. Here's a man with no known credentials who was placed on a pedestal. And for the British, then this became a very useful gateway into Kenya. And, even after independence, the British worked so hard to really keep Kenya within its orbit. Because if you look at very, very closely, in the south, Tanzania was the base for international, radical left. And as such, the British were afraid. On the northern side, you had, in both Somalia and Ethiopia, where the USSR and Cuba and as well as Yemen were on the same block. And then the United States trying to, cultivate Somalia, and then, 79, where the USSR switched sides very quickly, just about when the Ethiopian state was about to collapse because of fighting with Somalia, and took sides, and Siad Barre was left holding, the bag. And then the event of 79, USSR, Cuba, and Yemen switching sides really draws all the way up to where we are, in a sense that the collapse of Somalia, the end of Cold War in 89, and the United States remaining the preeminent power, decided that, look, this is going to be our first, international, relief mission to Somalia, Operation Restore Hope. Operation Restore Hope did not restore hope, and there wasn't even an operation to begin with. And Somalia, the collapse of Somalia, and then, if Kenyatta was just engaging with British through the lens of Cold War, where the United States was very afraid, the UK, the British were very afraid not to lose Kenya because of the Cold War, right? The second phase, which is the counter-terrorism phase, which again is pretty much manufactured. Al-Shabaab, worked on it for many, many years. Even at its highest, there's no way Al-Shabaab could overthrow Kenya. Even forget about Somalia, forget about Kenya. But Kenya passed the Prevention of Terrorism Act 2011, and that became the vehicle through which most of the dissent was crushed. If you look at the counterterrorism triangle, parts of Nairobi, part of the coast, and the northern parts of Kenya, where Kenyan military and security agencies were provided tremendous amount of training. Kenyan police officers are as trained as police officers anywhere else. But look at the training. Who is offering the training? The United States offering training on police reform, funding police reform in Kenya, and training the police, or the British Army training in northern part, in Nanyuki and Laikipia and that part of the country. That is, again, if the Batuk, that is the British Army training school, is the focal point or the launchpad for Kenyatta and the British establishment, including the Lanet incident of 1964, when Kenyatta relied on the British to crush, a dissent within the military. Then for Kenya, the establishment of National Counterterrorism Center, following the passage of Prevention of Terrorism Act 2011, then that becomes the vehicle through which the United States continues to exert influence on Kenya as such. Yes, for sure, the connection with Palestine genocide is very real. In terms of, then Ruto coming into the scene, it's nothing new. I mean, like, if you saw Ruto sitting at State House, it just felt, to my mind, someone, when you go and visit your dad at his shop or at his place of work, and he says, hey, do you mind sitting on my chair? How do you feel? Does it bring you joy? And all that kind of stuff. That was precisely how Ruto was treated. And that is not the most frustrating part. The most frustrating part is Ruto did not see it as such. Ruto thought that, look, here I am being welcomed, an ex-ICC indictee. Now I'm being invited to the inner sanctum of the White House, and I am the one now who is held up as an example for others, right? A good native informant that can be used. But the reality is, if you look at both Ruto as well as Biden, both of them are presidents with tremendous amount of trust deficit that both of them needed each other more than anything else. Because if you look, Biden coming into power, he said he will prioritize Africa, because the soundtrack of the United States and Western countries' engagement of the African continent is precisely anti-Chinese and increasingly anti-Russian rhetoric, especially with the emergence of the Wagner Group, as well as the war in Ukraine. As such, they both fit like a hand and a glove, because they were desperate. Because the Africa strategy that Biden and his team developed reads like a pamphlet that was developed at a retreat to absolutely mean nothing. Biden hasn't done anything towards it. He hasn't visited the continent. The only time high-level American officials visit African continent is when they want the votes regarding Ukraine. Sudan, one of the largest displacement in the world. It will have a distinct, dubious distinction of being a country where you have both potential genocide and potential famine going on at the same time. The best that the United States could do, right? They care about Africa. They have the African strategy. Was the Linda Thomas Greenfield, the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, going to the border in Adre in Chad to show solidarity. That was also a photo op right about when the UN General Assembly was going to take place last year in September. So as such, they needed each other. Ruto and Biden needed each other, and that had to happen. Slightly aligned with that is the sending of Kenya's troops Kenya's police, 1,000 police officers to Haiti. But nature has got an incredible sense of humor if you keenly follow it. On the eve of Kenyan police officers like that I've mentioned, that has got a rich history of egregious human rights violation. Police that we've spent so much money and so much time thinking about it being reformed. The Kenyan police is irredeemable. You cannot reform the Kenya police. But a lot of money, a lot of time, a lot of people's energy is spent on trying to reform these police. It can be reformed. You're trying to put lipstick on a pig, and on the eve of when the police were being deployed into Haiti, it's also the same time the riots and the protests in Kenya blew up. And so for Ruto, this comes not just as a serious problem domestically, but also internationally. He doesn't know how to deal with. This is a guy who came through Kanu, like my sister at the beginning, historicized the emergence of pro-democratic movement in the early 90s. Ruto was part of this state. Ruto was part of the Youth for Kano 92 that the late President Moi used to destabilize not just the opposition, but also the economy through printing a lot of money. All right. As such, nature serves you, some of these things called, and he was being served. I think in terms of the African continent and the level of solidarity that needs to be built, this is an incredible opportunity. Whether it leads to something else, I really would want it to. Even if it doesn't, we really desperately needed this. This was a massive catharsis, not just for Kenyans, but for the region. Look at the region where, countries like even Tanzania, somebody was just the other day jailed because they burnt the president photos. Yoweri Kaguta Museveni is sitting pretty in Uganda. So we needed this desperately. While we want it to grow into something massive, please, to everyone, we should celebrate. 7/7 celebration today in Kenya was desperately needed. That people going out in the face of domestic marginalization, in the face of absolute oppression, people went to the Uhuru Park. Uhuru is freedom. To Freedom Park to go and celebrate, to join the long list of Kenyans and moments that we had to celebrate. We should celebrate. We shouldn't wait. If this particular administration goes now or goes in 2027, I don't care, but this moment needs to be frozen in the hardest metal that we can get, be it diamond or anything, and be able to celebrate. It is a lesson for others. My sister from Nigeria who is moderating, Kenyans learn from your movement, because there is a continuous linkages between this movement that people learn from each other, being leaderless, coordinating, organizing, raising money. But I want to emphasize that sometimes in moments like this, we want that big man or woman of history. There are so many people, small people of history that pushed this, whether it is within the, desperate areas in the urban parts of Kenya, where I worked on police reform for a very long time. And my sister mentioned all the stuff around the police. We need to celebrate. This solidarity needs not to die now. You might not be in Nairobi. You might not be anywhere. There are lists of groups, organizations, people that are raising money. Your $100, your $10, your $5 can go a long way in helping people who have been maimed, people whose livelihood have been destroyed, mothers who have to pay the mortuary bills. That then shows that despite the internal oppression, despite the external IMF, World Bank, and the Department of Defense investing in people like William Ruto and others, Museveni and others, Kagame and others, people really come out in the most organic, in the most heartfelt, in the most realest of real. They're struggling. They don't know. This state only knows two languages. One is buying people. They cannot buy these people. This state also knows in killing people. They kill one, somebody emerges. They break people's legs, another one emerges. I think there are a couple of organizations, but in the interest, I won't be able to mention them. But I think I will share some of the links to individuals who are raising money, individuals that At this moment, humans are fallible. We have to be very careful. We need not to put people on the pedestal. People will make mistakes. We have to extend grace to them. But in areas where we see parasitic individuals taking advantage, we call them. That is the function of this moment. But there are other people beyond reproach who are raising money, who are doing everything to go and mourn with those people. The president has not been able to visit these people, but people in this movement have been able to go and mourn in solidarity, bury and do everything with the parents and families of this. I think those are the people that we need to invest in. But we have to be very careful that this moment need not to lead into despair in things that people have said that they are going to attain is not attained. Let it not eat on itself, because it's very easy. There are people who are spending every single minute of their time to try and tarnish the names of people who are doing wonderful work so that they can make it impossible to work. Over. Thank you to everyone.
Thank you so much, comrade. You've finished right on time. It's like you were, I wish I could be as effective as you when it comes to timekeeping. Next,
I have a time on mine next to my computer.
Oh, wow, smart. Okay. Next is going to be Mumbi Kanyogo, who is going to wrap up really neatly and tie all the various threads that we have been weaving together. Mumbi is going to talk to us about the place for global Pan-African solidarity from Nairobi to Port of Spain. Let me introduce Mumbi properly. Mumbi Makena Kanyogo is a writer, researcher, and educator working, thinking, and writing in solidarity with anyone and everyone, working towards the end of capitalism, imperialism, and cis heteropatriarchy. Her work has featured in The Republic and Open Democracy, amongst other places. She holds dear the experience of learning to see familiar things through newly encountered lenses, perspectives, and realities. This bio is very modest, but it's not going to be my place to say more things. So tell us how this Reject Finance Bill 2024 is relevant to other Pan-African situations happening, but also how we as non-Kenyan Africans can stand in solidarity with what is happening.
Okay, thank you so much, CJ. I'm going to try to be quick. I had written something out, but I'm going to shorten it. So essentially, I wrote this just in reference to what I've been seeing a lot of, and it's kind of what Kari was referring to, this exceptionalism around Kenya, which I think, and I'm going to argue, is really rooted in a desire to sort of sever Kenya's links to a history of global Pan-Africanism. We spoke, I think the speaker for Abdullahi was talking a lot about Kenyatta, who was, mythologized as the head of Mau Mau, but in actuality, he had very anti-socialist politics, oversaw, police violence and assassinations of actual socialist thinkers, and also criminalized the Mau Mau over time. And part of that work, I think, was also to sever, Kenya from, developing the political consciousness, the Pan-African consciousness, be able to identify and draw links between our situation and that of other people in other countries. So that's the question and the thing that I'm thinking about. So Kenya has always been situated as an exceptional nation state in the African context. In the African studies adjacent sort of global press, Kenya is regularly referred to as an oasis of, or an island of peace, stability, and democracy in a troubled region. In expert blogs, Kenyans have regularly been imagined as peace-loving people. And in the tech world, Kenya is the Silicon Savannah. But even now, as Kenyans fight against a neocolonial class that has banded up with the US and the IMF and the Euro-American bondholders, the global press has still insisted that Kenyans are fighting against excessive tax. No reference to the historical and global sources of these afflictions. It's just something that is emerging out of the blue, and it's particular to Kenya. So for me, I'm saying we have to ask, what do the local neocolonial class and their Western sponsors gain when we act as if we are all being uniquely harmed? What does the Africanist Academy gain when they are able to particularize each African country's issues? What do we as African people, as Kenyan people, lose when we cannot connect our crisis to that of others? The function of this exceptionalism, this narrative isolation, is to situate Kenya as different and often as better than other African countries, particularly those that surround it. And what has emerged in practice is that Kenya's problems have been particularized such that the violence of poverty, imperial meddling, militarism, police violence, political repression, ethno-nationalism, patriarchy, the same problems that afflict our neighbors have been erased from how we and others in the world diagnose our crisis, including the one that we are facing right now. Ours is always a crisis that is reimagined through the liberal terms of bad leadership, tax hikes, crony capitalism, and it's never one of imperialism, neocolonialism, and capitalism. So to me, this exceptionist rendering of Kenya can be traced back to the colonial period. Unlike many other colonies that were staffed by technocrats, working class white people, Kenya's settler class largely consisted of lords, baronets, upper class aspirants, whose migration to Kenya had been triggered by a desire to salvage their declining Victorian good life, a life that had been interrupted by the post-First World War emergence of the British welfare state that had in part been established through wealth taxes. So to do this, they needed to white colonial. They needed to evacuate settler colonial Kenya of blackness. In the settler colonial context, blackness was imagined as violence, contagion, lack of control, laziness, and ignorance. But by the time the emergency period in the 1950s had rolled around, a time that was marked by militant trade unionism and the Mau Mau uprising, blackness became synonymous with rebellion, resistance, militancy, and Mau Mau of solidarity. So in a way, blackness becomes anti-coloniality. And as we know, anti-coloniality, anti-imperialism were also the basis for Pan-African solidarity, such that having been influenced by Piogama Pinto, a Kenyan social trade unionist, and having witnessed the power of anti-colonial consciousness and armed struggle during the struggle of the Mau Mau, Malcolm X, in a 1964 speech in Harlem, could say, in fact, that's what we need in Mississippi. In Mississippi, we need a Mau Mau. In Alabama, we need a Mau Mau. In Georgia, we need a Mau Mau. Right here in Harlem, in New York City, we need a Mau Mau. The function of the drive to sever Kenya from blackness and at the same time exceptionalize and isolate Kenya has always been to prevent a Pan-African consciousness and solidarity emerging. But there have always been groups that have outrightly rejected this, from the Kenyans for Palestine group that has been organizing against the genocide in Kenya and highlighting multiple complicities in it, particularly the complicities of our political class and also different retailers as well, to the Mwakanya movement of the 90s and the early 2000s. So even as we work to reject Ruto, reject the finance bill, and reject our political class, we must also remember that this is a fight to reject neocolonialism and imperialism, and a fight to reject forms of analysis that center the nation state as the only unit of analysis. This is an argument the Egyptian socialist scholar Samia Amin had, and in turn exceptionalize African states, including Kenya. And ultimately, we must work to regenerate a Pan-African ethic of solidarity. And to me, I want to think about solidarity as the call for solidarity from our movement as an invitation to participate in struggle. As in, if we deal a blow against the global financial system that forces Africans to prioritize debt repayment over people, will you, sitting in Uganda, sitting in Nigeria, sitting in Ghana, will you deal a blow against American foreign policy officials in Washington, D.C., who give the IMF its mandate? So the question is, how will we each deal our blow? So now I want to share 3 reasons why the fight against Ruto is also a fight against neocolonialism and imperialism, a Pan-African struggle. So this is sort of just a summary of what everyone has been talking about. I think it's necessary that we join these dots more clearly for people. So the fight against Ruto and Kenya's political class is also a fight against the use of debt to undermine African sovereignty. So as we know, 7 out of 10 tax Kenyan shillings goes towards paying Kenya's debt, and it doesn't go towards healthcare, education, or infrastructure. So Issa Shivji has theorized this as debt slavery as part of the turn towards the neoliberal accumulation by appropriation, as opposed to the accumulation via capitalization during the developmental period in the 60s. So there's an essay that was published in The Elephant, somewhere where I think Mary Serumaga and others have published in. So it's called Pan-Africanism and the Unfinished Task of Liberation and Social Emancipation. And he writes, programs and policies undertaken in the nationalist period, whether under the ideology of modernization or socialism, were meant to bolster the tendency for accumulation by capitalization, aka industrialization. But under the hegemony of imperialism, accumulation by appropriation continues to assert and reassert itself, using local state or private merchant capital as the intermediary and trade, aid, and debt as the means. So as Western countries receive loans at low interest rates with little pushback to pay them back, African countries are forced to pay back at the expense of development and even the ability to survive. So we must demand a lawful debt audit. We know that Ruto recently announced that he'd be creating a task force in order to initiate a debt audit, but we know that task force has no kind of teeth. And Africans everywhere must also demand debt cancellation and accountability for bondholders in various Euro-American countries to ensure that there's fair debt restructuring. So I'm really inspired by the work of Nawi Collective and also the African Sovereign Debt Justice Network. Secondly, the fight against Ruto and Kenya's political class is also a fight against the use of multilateral financial institutions to implement American foreign policy. So upon providing a refinancing loan to help Kenya pay back the Eurobonds it took for development purposes, I mean, some of it was stolen, but the purpose was development, the IMF has instituted conditionalities that promise to ideologically repress universities by further defunding the arts and humanities, further privatizing parastatals that provide Kenyans with goods below market price, a demand for an increase in taxes from VAT to income taxes, complete removal of fuel subsidies. At the same time in Zambia, as the IMF, sorry, that was my time, as the IMF paid its first tranche of refinancing loans in the late 2022, the IMF also required Zambia to eliminate its fuel and electricity subsidies VAT, something that was also happened in Kenya. So as Grieve Chalwe has argued, from Zambia to Kenya, the IMF is restructuring economies in ways that don't eliminate structural dependency on the West and ultimately short-circuit the methods we could use to ensure our economic in the long run. So we must demand that our government stop seeking out medium-term loans from the IMF, but more broadly and more long-term, we must also demand that our government seek out loans from other multinational institutions such as the BRICS New Development Bank, which is upcoming, in order to eliminate our dependencies and move us to a stage where we are solving debt in a way that still allows us to industrialize. And lastly, very quickly, the fight against Ruto and Kenya's political class is also a fight against imperial occupation. As Professor Jemima Pierre has argued, Haiti has and continues to be the main laboratory for US imperial machinations in the region and throughout the world. The current partnership between Kenya, the US, and the United Nations to occupy Haiti under the auspices of peacekeeping against Haitian gangs is ultimately a scheme to rebrand US imperialism, using Black faces in high places. Kenya is participating in a rearticulation of US imperialism that seeks to further normalize and whitewash over 20 years of the suspension of the Haitian constitution. Haitians have been resisting Ruto and the US. Even before our Reject Finance bill protests, Haitians were staging protests against Ruto and the Kenyan police, both in Haiti and in the US. Their protest to me served as an important invitation if we're thinking about a timeline for Kenyans to also resist Ruto and his appropriation of Pan-African aesthetics without any Pan-African intent. we have to build solidarity with Haiti around the world, because as we know, as Jemima Pierre has argued, in this use of Kenya in order to achieve US foreign policy goals, and is a model that's going to continue to be used. It's something that we need to note and think about how to resist. So we have to build solidarity with Haiti, both in Kenya and other African countries. And we must do this through political education, breaking down this anti-Black analysis that Haiti, the problems in Haiti are produced by gangs and not US, UN, Canadian imperial meddling, and also protest Ruto wherever he's gone. Haitians have provided us a really important invitation. So I'll stop there and hand over to Basiji.
Thank you so much, Mumbi. You actually used less time than we had allocated, which gives us more time for the Q&A. Nanri, take it away and lead us into the last segment.
Yes, thank you so much, and thank you, Mumbi. I think it was a very good conclusion of this this tremendous conversation that has created so much knowledge and richness. A rich conversation. We've gone through the history of solidarity, histories of exploitation. We've spoken about the Mau Mau, the Saba Saba. We've gone across continents to talk about everywhere from Uganda to Haiti to the Sahel, and really just people have really brought together all the rich historical connections, but also the connections across the African diaspora, across African countries, and really have emphasized the need for solidarity wherever imperialism meets us. And I really appreciate one of the quotes in particular, saying one of the quotes that said, what are you going to do? What is your own role? What is your own part of the struggle? And so I think the best way to end, because we don't really have time for a Q&A, and I also haven't seen questions from the audience, is to bring everybody back on, and for each speaker just to have maybe 1 minute to make their closing remarks. I have a few suggestions, but you can make the remarks however you please. I think one of the things that we could maybe wrap up talking about is by thinking about activists on the streets today and kind of bringing it back and deeply grounding it into the present struggle that has taken place over the last few weeks, is how are young people, how are young people using this knowledge, historical knowledge? How are they using knowledge of the Pan-Africanist struggles? Are they talking about what's happening in Haiti? Are they talking about are young people really understanding and discussing IMF and the World Bank, and where are these conversations going? And really, how can we best stand in solidarity? What does solidarity mean to the people in the room who are listening from all over the world? We have over 500 people listening in on this call. So maybe just talking about the practicalities of what solidarity looks like. I won't take speakers' time, so we'll just please have just 1 minute, 60 seconds, and trusting everybody to keep to that time so we can round up on the hour. So I'm just going to start with on the right of me on the screen here is our comrade Mary. So if you can have 1 minute of your concluding remarks, please. Okay, you're on mute.
I just want to say how much I appreciated the last presentation. I found I learned a lot from it. I hadn't understood Kenya in the way she presented it today. But the thing in my mind is, where do we go from here? And you put it in this way. You said, what does it mean to stand in solidarity? Because I've been on a similar thing about Palestine, and this thing that is very educational and cathartic even. But we tend to sort of end there. We tend to come away without a way forward charted. We know what we have, different ideas that we can put together, but we don't actually put them together and say, okay, so what we're going to do is do this first, second, and third in order to further solidarity. So I was just wondering whether it was going to be different today.
Okay. Thank you so much, Comrade Mary. Caroline?
Yes, in just 1 minute, just to refer to your comment or your question around history and young people and Gen Z. So, in a country where the arts and history are subjects within the education system, a country where these things have been rubbished, I really think that young people, Gen Z, are really trying and they're listening. They're listening to the scholars, like Mombi, for example, who with us and is really doing a great job in, through the socials in just giving that historical context to everything that we are talking about on the socials. And I think young people are listening, young people are being receptive, especially when they find out some things that they didn't know and they should have known, because the education system it has been structured in such a way that these things are not talked about. So are young people listening? Yes, they are. And they're taking these conversations to a place like TikTok, for example, where they're very robust. There are robust. Sorry, there are robust conversations going on there, discussions, a lot of education that is happening. So are young people listening? Yes, I would say they are. But facilitation usually not offered and is actually stifled. Yeah, I would say that.
Thank you. Thank you, Caroline. Abdullahi?
Yeah, I think mine is just again, we have a massive opportunity, and following up on what the previous speaker said. Look, this is the administration where the president said, look, we do not recognize art. We only recognize science. But what did this movement show us? Kenyans have got an incredible amount of humor, love, music, art has been the engine of this protest. So I think when we tell our kids, when we tell ourselves that, oh no, we all want to be scientists and engineers and I've got nothing against them and God bless their souls, the art is again the theater, the music. Like Kenyans love to make fun of even situations that are unbearably difficult. You see people, the sort of music and tracks that were dropped during this moment. I think there's a friend of mine who is a historian who's putting all these and archiving them. It just shows us that again, we might be gaslit into thinking that science is the way. We all need to become slaves of Mark Zuckerberg and his cronies. No, we don't have to. We don't need to. We can be farmers and play music and songs and enjoy ourselves, and let not anybody deny that from us. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter where people in the academy, the African studies, whatever universities that are largely led by, will tell us. But Kenyans, again, in a very organic style, in a very art-driven, combining generation, historicizing, contextualizing, and having fun while at it, I think it's something that it needs to be enjoyed, needs to be celebrated, and then breaking these nonsense blinkers that Kenyans wear, exceptionalize the Kool-Aid that we drink. We are not. Kenya is just another ghetto. Let's get used to it. It's just another, colonial settler outpost. We need to embrace that and move with the time. Over.
Thank you, Comrade Abdullahi. Over to Faith, and then Mumbi, you can wrap up. Faith, please go ahead.
Yes, thank you. I think what does solidarity look like for us? One, solidarity looks like exposing who Ruto is. He's a US puppet, and that needs to be out there. That his voice, even when supporting Israel, is not the support from Kenyans. When he's sending police to Haiti, is not the Kenyans who are doing that. That is Ruto because he's working for the US. He's just a puppet. Also, I think people showing the world what is happening in Kenya, how Ruto is abducting people in broad daylight, how he's arresting innocent people and killing them like chicken on the streets. That needs to be out there, and the demands of the people and what the people are asking, because most there's this picture that Ruto has been painted outside there, like as if he's a Pan-Africanist and all that, and that needs to be seen that Ruto is not a Pan-Africanist. Ruto does not care about his people. He does not care about anyone. He only cares about what is being told by the people put him in power, and that is what he's going to implement. I think that is what I would say solidarity looks like for us, just being out there telling the world, exposing Ruto, but also standing in solidarity with Kenyans and the voice of Kenyans. If they're supporting the Palestine people, that needs to be outside there because that is the voice of Kenyans. Whatever Ruto is doing, he's doing it on his own, but he's doing it for his masters. His masters. So thank you so much, and thank you for having me in this space. I'm so happy to be in a space with all of you, and thank you so much for having this conversation.
Okay. Just to add to what Faith has said, Carla and Mary, Abdullahi, I think for me it would be we have to draw the connections between what's happening locally in Kenya and elsewhere. I think if we're thinking about imperialism as a global system, if we know that our leaders, think they are funded together and that they're part of the same neo-colonial class, then us in Kenya resisting Ruto is also a blow against Museveni in Uganda, is also a blow against Tinubu in Nigeria. So conversely, if people are to fight their various neo-colonial masters in various countries, if people in the US, as we have said, Griff Chawa has insisted that, it's important that IMF and World Bank are situated in Washington, D.C. What can people in the US do in order to undermine and to protest the IMF and World Bank there? So if we all deal our blows, we're able to weaken the system and live another day to fight. So that would be my invitation.
Thank you so much, Mumbi. Again, great concluding remarks from everyone, and really appreciating that last comment on DC. I really remembered when just a few weeks ago people were so happy that they held a presidential dinner for the for the Kenyan president, and just the dynamics of not understanding kind of what that meant for so many people who were celebrating a black African being invited to the White House and not really understanding how that was part of the neo-colonial imperialist project. I've just been so honestly awestruck by these amazing organizers and activists, and have really appreciated each and every one of you in this conversation. So I'll hand over to Comrade Boisige, and thank you so much, everyone.
This has been the longest, I think, that we've had. It must be very late in Kenya and East Africa generally. It's been such a pleasure. But I also want to, 9 p.m. I also want to point out the fact that in all the places that we've been talking about, and this is also happening in Kenya right now, there is a huge and very violent, deadly military crackdown happening to shut down these protests. People are showing up dead in not swimming pools, in swamps, in forests, so everywhere these protests are put down with so much force. And of course, we cannot we cannot excuse the IMF. In fact, this blood is on the hands of the IMF, because among the very many conditions they put on these loans, they do not put a condition on not using force. But also we know that some of this money is used to buy arms, you know? So they put conditions on, you can't use this money for this, you can't use this money for this, and you have to stop doing this to qualify to get this money. But they don't say anything about how violent you can get in having their way. So I just wanted to make that conclusion, but also to honor the people who have lost their lives during this time, and also to send strength and power and, you know, more courage to those that are on the front lines fighting against this. We don't know when our next episode will be. So just like last time, we didn't know this was going to happen. So we didn't know the episode was going to come earlier. But thank you for showing up, the many people that have showed up today, and those who are going to watch this later. We really appreciate this, and we are open to suggestions for other things we can do, other topics, and join our network and watch our other episodes. This is episode 10. So that's a lot of work. And we're looking forward to the next one. Thank you, Nanri, for the opportunity to do this with you. Also, thank you, Crystal, for just keeping quiet and letting everything happen smoothly. So while the rest of us are here talking, and you just behind there sorting everything and making sure everything is happening as it is supposed to. Thank you again. It's such a pleasure for co-hosting this. And thanks to everybody else. Thanks to all the speakers for sparing their Sundays to be here. And thanks to everybody for tuning in. It's been such a pleasure co-hosting these 3 episodes.
Yeah, and just one last note, if you, because of, I really appreciate you ending with those points, Comrade Bray. And just so you know, we do look for ways to support organizers, but there is a lack of safety in terms of publishing a lot of these things. So if you are looking for more ways to support, you can reach out to any of the organizations that hosted this chat. And there are ways in which you can stand in solidarity. We're also going to post different social media on the different chats, on the different platforms, the BLM Philly and the Ubuntu Reading Group as well, so that you can follow some of these speakers and continue to learn about the struggles. So thank you again, and please continue to find ways to support activism and activists on the front lines as we try to do through this forum.